Good evening. I'm David Lair, President of Community Advocates, one of the co-founders of this America at a Crossroads series of town halls. I welcome you to our 111th consecutive weekly program on behalf of Community Advocates, Inc., which I head, and my partner, Janice Kaminer-Resnick, the president of Jews United for Democracy and Justice, who cannot be with us this evening. She's out of the country. And JUDJ's executive committee, including Zev Yaroslavsky, Mel Levine, Rabbi Ken Chasen, Caroline Kelly, and Janice, of course. As I mentioned last week, when we had two election experts discussing voting suppression the day after the Georgia primary, sometimes the programming gods are with us. Tonight, they have doubly blessed us. Who knew when we invited the New York Times' Peter Baker months ago that the prior day would bring us the most explosive investigative congressional hearing on presidential conduct in half a century? But they have, and Peter is the person to discuss where we are and what the day of high drama means. He also is a maven on the war in Ukraine, and we will be discussing that shortly. Next week, we will host Peter's colleague at the Times, its longtime, widely cited columnist, David Brooks. He'll be in conversation with KPCC's Larry Mantle. David is always thoughtful and offers new, illuminating perspectives on events. The following week, we'll have Bill Browder, the author of New York Times bestselling book, Freezing Order. He was at one time Russia's largest foreign investor before he became the subject of Vladimir Putin's ire, an anger that was accompanied with murder, money laundering, and much more. In coming weeks, we'll host social psychologist Jonathan Haidt, Ambassador Dennis Ross, Chair of Homeland Security Senator Gary Peters, David Gergen, Ambassador Mike McFaul, and more. You will receive emails about them all. And now I have the pleasure of introducing a longtime friend, former Congressman Mel Levine, a founding member of the JUDJ Executive Committee and an invaluable resource in securing the top-notch speakers we have had thus far. He will introduce tonight's guest and our moderator. Mel?
Thanks so much, David. I'm really delighted that we have a return of Peter Baker, one of America's premier journalists. Ironically, I'll note on a personal level that this has kind of been Peter Baker Day for me. I woke up to his prominent New York Times front page story that David alluded to with the headline, "Increasingly Unhinged as Power Shifts Away," a really marvelous summation of what happened at yesterday's very significant hearing, followed by hearing his take on yesterday's hearing on Sirius XM radio. And my day will be capped by his being with us this evening. Between the subjects of Trump and Ukraine, probably the two of the three most salient subjects facing us, along with abortion, Madeleine's going to have a very difficult challenge deciding how to parse her questions, because Peter's an expert, as David indicated, on both of those subjects. Very briefly, by way of prior background, Peter spent 20 years at the Washington Post covering the White House under Presidents Clinton and W, and 4 years as co-bureau chief with his wife, Susan Glasser, in Moscow. He joined the New York Times just in time to be reassigned to the White House as Donald Trump ascended to the White House. In the course of all of that, he has written 6 books, all of which have been quite acclaimed. And somehow, while covering and focusing on the Trump administration, he and Susan managed to write an incredible biography of James Baker, the man who ran Washington. It was a book that I couldn't put down and that I highly recommend. We are very, very fortunate to have Madeleine Brand to do our moderating. Madeleine is a frequent host on these programs. She's the host of KCRW's daily broadcast of news and culture press play. She's the recipient of numerous awards for journalistic excellence, including an Emmy. She has taught radio journalism at the Columbia School of Journalism, a school my wife attended. And with that, Madeleine, it's all yours.
Thank you. Thanks, Mel. That was a very generous introduction. And thank you, David, for having me back. And Peter, welcome back. You're also making a return appearance.
Thank you.
So I understand you have yet another book coming out in September called The Divider: Trump in the White House 2017 to 2021. So I guess my first question is, are you revising it at all given what happened yesterday?
It's a great question, Madeleine. Thank you very much for the question. And thank you for doing this tonight. I'm really excited to be having this conversation with you. And thank you to Janice and David and Congressman Levine. Congressman, it's a little too much Peter Baker, even for me. I hope tomorrow you get a little bit of a break from that. It's so funny that you asked that, because just today at noon, my wife and I had to turn in the final corrections to the book. And it was beyond the point where they allowed us to do any actual substantive rewriting. And we asked, look, this is really interesting. Shouldn't we add this to the book? And they said, look, you're done. That's it. The book industry is really the last of the most antiquated industries in our country. The last, 3 months out, they can't do anything to update it. But we've got a lot of the same stuff in the book anyway. I think we've got a lot of the flavor and the larger points that came up yesterday in the book about a president who is volatile and disruptive, and obviously was quite a unique figure in American history.
Well, we really got a view into his personality, as you detailed in your story today. Did you also get that from the sources who talked to you for your book, his temper in the White House and what that looked like?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. This is a guy who is, and part of this we saw in public too, right? I think a lot, of Trump is on display at all times. He doesn't really hide who he is. He is, in some senses, more transparent than any president we've ever had, because he doesn't really, he doesn't disguise his nature. Now, he's obviously more volatile, more angry, more willing to display that in private with his staff than he is in public, but you get a sense of it, I think, from his speeches and his press conferences and his rallies. And I don't think we've ever seen quite like it. I talked to a lot of historians yesterday. I spent a lot of time reading about history myself. Nixon in his final days obviously was seen as a little bit unstable, was worried anyway, worried his staff about that. But, the idea of a president who was willing to do what this president was willing to do to subvert an election that he lost, we've never seen anything like that.
Right. And in terms of this idea of him being a very stable genius, or however he likes to describe himself, when you think of what Bill Barr said in the testimony, where he called him unhinged, what was your assessment when you interviewed insiders for the book, and even in your coverage of the White House, of his mental state, aside from the rage, but the stability of his mental state? And I know you're not a mental health professional, but
it's a great question. It was a lingering and persistent question for 4 years during his presidency, and we did talk about that a lot with the people we interviewed. And I'm not a doctor, and neither are they, and so it's hard to make any kind of a medical diagnosis from afar by people who don't know what they're talking about. There's no question, though, that one of the things that was a consistent theme of the people we talked to was their perception that he was unpredictable, erratic, volatile, driven by his own sort of narcissistic demands and desires. Everything was about personal loyalty to him, his ability to control himself, to process information. All these things were issues that were brought up to us again and again and again by the people who work for him. And again, what's really striking about these interviews we've done for this book and the people we've seen in these hearings in the last few weeks, these are not Democrats, and they're not deep state conspirators that Trump likes to blame. These are Republicans, and not even never Trumper Republicans. These are Republicans that he himself hired, that he himself appointed, and that wanted to go work for him. And they are giving testimony now through these hearings and in the interviews we did for our book about what they saw.
Mm. But I think a lot of us are wondering why they didn't say anything until now. Many of them, most of them. Yeah. And why didn't they say anything until now, until they were hauled in front of a hearing room or on TV?
It's a great question, and some of them will have to answer for that in history. There were some who did speak out, but you're right, most of them did not. And I think that it's a combination of party loyalty, which is hard to break in Washington, whether you're Democrat or Republican. It's a sense that you care about the issues that you were working on, and therefore you don't want to undercut them. I think there's some who fear the reprisals that come from breaking with Trump and absorbing what the blowback they know would come. There's a sense by some that it doesn't make a difference, that that the public isn't. The public has made up his mind about Trump, whether you love him or hate him. Nobody is changing their minds about him. So I think it's a combination of issues there. But you're right. I think it's a question that they will be asked, and that the history will ask them. If you knew this at the time, how come you didn't speak out more forcefully at the time when people would have been useful to know?
I think one person.
One thing, in fact, I would say, by the way, sorry, to continue, there were some people who broke with him, less senior people like Miles Taylor, Olivia Troy, and some others who did speak out prior to the election and tried to get larger figures, more well-known figures to speak out, cabinet officers, people who were very disturbed by Trump to speak out before the 2020 election, and they wouldn't. So it was a real tension there within Trump circles. Who speaks out, who doesn't, when do you speak out, why do you speak out, and what will you accomplish if you did?
Yeah, well, I think that's also something fascinating, is the hold that he has on these people, many of whom were captains of industry, Rex Tillerson, or others who were leading figures in the military or elsewhere, who seemed cowed by him. To what do you attribute that?
It's really interesting, right? You wouldn't think that a simple tweet would be so scary.
Yeah.
And yet he managed to really dominate his party in a way that I'm not sure we've seen any president ever do. Nixon's party broke away from him, obviously. There were times when Clinton's party broke away from him. Carter's party broke away from him. Even Reagan faced more opposition among Republicans at times than we have seen willing to oppose Trump. And now that's except for the ones who just go all out, right? This group will see Sarah Longwell and Bill Kristol, I see later this summer. They're examples of people who decide they're all out against Trump, and they're going to be flatly, overtly, and unreservedly against Trump. But except for those, a lot of the people in Washington, especially office holders, they just found it too difficult to break with him. I talked to a Republican senator once. He said, look, he has the support of 90% of my Republicans in my state. So what am I going to gain by breaking with him? The Democrats aren't going to vote for me. Even the moderates or independents are probably still not going to vote for me. All I'm going to do is alienate the people I need to vote for me. And that's a calculation. So it's a cynical calculation, you might say, but it is a calculation that politicians make. And the calculation is that Trump is more popular with their constituents than they are.
Mm-hmm. So I get it if you're seeking office and you're trying to fight for your political survival. But if you're Pat Cipollone, for example, why is it in your interest to keep silent?
That's a good question. Pat Cipollone, for those who may not have heard of him, was the last White House counsel. Very conservative. He got the job because his friend Laura Ingraham recommended him to Trump. Again, no shrinking violet and he stood up to Trump repeatedly, we're told now in these last few weeks of the administration, threatening to resign over some of this election fraud stuff, saying, if you go that far, I can't stay with you here. I'm going to have to break with you. What you're talking about is not legal. What you're talking about is not constitutional. And yet you're right. He's not said one word publicly. And he hasn't agreed to testify. And I think, I can't speak for Pat, obviously, but what I know of him, my guess is that he thinks his role as a lawyer is not to speak out, that his job is to represent his client, and that he represented the office of the presidency when Donald Trump was in office, and whatever reservations he had, that he has an obligation as a lawyer to keep them private. Now, that may not satisfy a lot of people, and a lot of lawyers would say that's not right too, I'm sure. But my guess is that's his thinking.
So it takes a 25-year-old political neophyte to possibly bring all this down. Was that surprising to you?
It's amazing, isn't it? Right. So Cassidy Hutchinson, 25 years old, gets the job at the White House, basically out of college, and turns out to be Zelig. She's in the room for all of these amazing, remarkable moments. She was attacked today by Trump world for, who said, well, she's just a coffee getter. She wasn't senior. She wasn't important. That's not the point. The point is not what role she played in the White House. The point is, was she in the room? Did she hear things? Did she see things? And she was, whatever her job was, and she obviously wasn't a senior official, but whatever her job was, it was certainly more than getting coffee. And more importantly, she was there to bear witness. I was in the White House today. I was standing next to the desk that she used to sit at. It is a stone's throw from the Oval Office. It is right there, the Chief of Staff's office. Everybody who comes in and out of that Chief of Staff's office, she sees, she understands what happens. She had a vantage point that very few people had, and she decided to share it with the committee and with the country. And I thought for a 25-year-old, whether you like her or not, whatever you think of her testimony, she was remarkably composed, remarkably matter of fact. She didn't look like she was enjoying it. She was not like an attention seeker. She didn't look like she was somebody who was, spinning tall tales for the sake of, enjoying it. She was providing, in a factual, meticulous, and careful way what she saw and heard. And, they're now challenging her one story, particularly about the Secret Service and the reaching for the wheel, right? She didn't pretend that she saw it. She's simply saying what she was told by a deputy chief of staff who was a former Secret Service agent. Now, maybe she was misinformed. Maybe she wasn't. Maybe the event took place a little bit differently, but they're trying to use that to cut at her credibility. The truth is, I think she seemed very, very powerful in her testimony for all the reasons you just said and for the reasons we just talked about.
And you interviewed someone who worked with Ken Starr on Clinton's impeachment, and he said to you that Trump has criminal culpability on the worst charge, seditious conspiracy.
Yeah.
What was the smoking gun in his mind?
Yeah, it's rather remarkable. This is a guy named Solomon Weisenberg. Sol was a deputy to Ken Starr during the Clinton impeachment. Again, he's not some, liberal Democrat here. This is a guy who's a pretty tough on Democrats in the past, obviously. And even a few weeks ago told me he wasn't 100% sure that the committee had the goods on Trump. And he watched what he saw yesterday and he told me, he said, this is the smoking gun. There's now a prima facie case, that is to say, on the surface case, that the President of the United States, former President of the United States, committed what he called seditious conspiracy. Now, let's keep in mind that there was no trial yesterday. There was nobody who was on Trump's side. He had no defense attorney there. The witness was not subjected to cross-examination. No defense witnesses were presented to rebut her story. So we have to keep in mind still one-sided version of the story. But having watched that, Saul Weisenberg, an experienced veteran prosecutor, said that this demonstrated that Trump knew that his crowd included people who were bearing weapons, including firearms. He understood that. He wanted to, in fact, take down the Secret Service magnetometers that would stop people with weapons. He said, they're not here to harm me. And that he was then going to encourage them to go to the Capitol. That it's to him suggested, as Saul Weisenberg suggested, knowledge, understanding that what he was doing was dangerous and reckless and putting in jeopardy the Congress of the United States, as it was not just meeting in session, but there to perform the most important act in a way that it does every 4 years, which is to finalize the election of a president of the United States. And so it was a rather striking observation by Saul Weisenberg. And I think that other people feel the same way, that yesterday provided something we hadn't seen before, which is testimony about Trump's knowledge about the potential for violence.
And as you say, there was some dispute over whether he actually grabbed the wheel or whatever, but there's no dispute that he wanted to go to the Capitol. Exactly.
I'm glad you pointed that out, because that's the more important element of that story. In fact, the Secret Service folks who have anonymously denied that he reached for the wheel or that he tried to lunge for an agent say he did. They do confirm that he still, even in that moment, wanted to go to the Capitol. The idea was he was going to go down there with a crowd of supporters that he knew had weapons, in order to try to pressure the Congress of the United States not to ratify his defeat at an election. And that's, again, that part of the story is unrebutted by the Secret Service. And the most important thing, one of the most important things that I think that came out of yesterday's testimony.
What was he going to do when he got there? Was he going to go inside with them? Does anybody know?
There was talk that he would go into the House chamber. He would he would directly confront the lawmakers as they were counting the Electoral College votes. I mean, with the power of a crowd of supporters outside, some of whom had weapons, the idea was at the very least to pressure Congress into to rejecting some of the swing state electoral votes that had gone for Joe Biden. And remember, he was pressuring not only members of Congress, he was pressuring his own vice president. He was never going to win. He was never going to convince Democrats in the House to go along with this. But if he could convince his own vice president to declare that he had the power somehow to reject these electoral college votes, then that would muddy the water, and who knows what would happen, potentially even somehow keep him in office.
I think just what's extraordinary about a lot of this is just how few people stood between that desire and the fact that it didn't happen. In every turn, at every hearing, there are a handful of people, one person who stands up or two or what have you. And it is just, like, if it had gone the other way, if Pence had said, okay, I will, or if Raffensperger had bowed to the pressure, or any of these single individuals, what do you take from that?
Well, I think you make a very, very important point. I think that's exactly right. We were so close to a much worse situation, by a single person, a single vice president, a single attorney general, a single governor, or secretary of state, local, state secretary of state like Brad Raffensperger in Georgia you cited. If even one of them had gone along and said, Trump is right, the election was stolen, it would have created just enough doubt, just enough, muddying the water, that it would have created a much more volatile situation. He wanted to put in place an attorney general, a guy named Jeffrey Clark, who had agreed to write a letter to Georgia saying, we, the Justice Department, have found that there was enough question about this election that you should go back into special session and rethink giving your electoral college votes to Joe Biden. If he had made that guy, Jeffrey Clark, the attorney general, and the attorney general of the United States then sent a letter like that, imagine what would have happened. So I think you're right. The institutions, people like to say, well, the institutions are strong because they held. The institutions were really a handful of people. And you can see how in a different circumstance, it might have gone in a very different direction.
So getting back to yesterday, what we learned about Meadows and the way that Cassidy Hutchinson portrayed him as seemingly disinterested when she said there were armed mobs, and seemingly disinterested when she and Cipollone begged him to go to Trump and say, make him stop this, scrolling through his phone repeatedly, sort of out of it. Talk a little bit about him, because you have probably interviewed him a lot, right, for your work and your books, and you know who he is. Can you shed some more light on Mark Meadows and his role in this?
Yeah, I think he is one of the most fascinating figures in this. And I'm glad you cited what she said about him, because I think it was obviously a devastating portrayal by somebody who worked for him directly and had been loyal to him, who was not disinclined to Mark Meadows. In fact, the opposite, really, admired him and liked him. But that was one of the key mysteries to us as we started our research for our book. What was Mark Meadows' role in all this? Because we were getting different stories. Some people were saying he was a land the plane guy. And by that, I mean, there was a handful of people around the president who were trying to just keep things steady, keep the thing from getting too far out of control, land the plane and end the administration peacefully and safely. That people like Mike Pompeo and General Mark Milley and so forth. And some people said Mark Meadows was one of those guys, that yes, he was sort of humoring the president on this election stuff, but behind the scenes, he was trying to play more of a stabilizing kind of role, kind of like Al Haig in the last days of Watergate. And then the others were saying, no, he was one of the guys who was trying to hijack the plane. He wasn't trying to land it. He was trying to hijack it. He was in league with the election deniers and the people who were trying to overturn this. And I think what we found in our research, and certainly what we've now seen demonstrated pretty viscerally in the last few weeks of these hearings, and especially yesterday, is he was not one of the land the plane guys. In fact, he was much more in the enabling Trump category, who was not only not stopping President Trump, but but basically empowering him and encouraging him to wage this fight, allowing people into the Oval Office who would never be allowed into any other president's Oval Office. People like Sidney Powell and Mike Lindell, the pillow guy, and Mike Flynn, who was advocating, martial law. Those are things any normal chief of staff that I've ever known. I've known a dozen or more of them. Written a book about James Baker, the most famous of them. No other chief of staff would have ever allowed that to happen. We talked to a Republican who used the word to compare Mark Meadows. He was a matador. He was like just waving the flag and letting everybody come into the Oval Office who wanted to come in, no matter how fringy or off base they might have been. So I think the text messages that he provided the committee and that have been released demonstrate that, right? So on some level, yes, he was trying to reassure people like Bill Barr, no, it's okay. We're trying to keep them, from going too far. I think he's being more realistic. And then he sends a text to somebody like Ginny Thomas, and he says, this is, comparing it to a religious crusade, in effect, saying this is a battle of good versus evil. Almost messianic terms.
We lost you for a sec there. You said messianic?
Yeah, I thought, he sent this one text. So on the one hand, he would be reassuring people like Bill Barr, oh no, don't worry, the president's becoming more realistic here. It won't get out of hand. This will come to an end. And then on the other hand, he would send a text message the next day to Ginny Thomas saying, comparing this to sort of a messianic religious crusade, that this fight over the election was really a battle of good versus evil, and that we have to prevail in order to do the Lord's work. So I think he was very famous in this White House among people we interviewed for telling people what they wanted to hear, for playing both sides. But I think that his own text messages seemed to make very clear, and Cassidy Hutchinson's testimony yesterday made very clear which camp he was really in.
Is he particularly religious?
He is religious, yes, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a lot of religious people who didn't believe the election was stolen. I mean, it's not, he decided to cast it in religious terms.
Yeah, but Ginny Thomas is religious as well.
Very much so, yeah.
Very observant. From what you've been able to glean, what was her role in all of this?
Ginny Thomas, she was a cheerleader on the sidelines, obviously. She's a conservative activist. Obviously, for those who may not know her, she's the wife of Justice Clarence Thomas. Long before this election, she had been a very vocal and active player on conservative issues, involved with lots of advocacy groups. But the text messages that have come out indicate how far she was, into this sort of fringe part of the spectrum that believed the election was stolen, that was encouraging these fake electors to be sent to Washington to substitute, Trump for Biden votes, to overturn the will of the people. And she was very clear in the text message she sent that, anybody who didn't do this was failing the cause. And the thing that makes that important and unusual, of course, is that she's the spouse of a sitting Supreme Court justice who was asked more than once to weigh in on these very issues. And that's, we've had justices' spouses and judges' spouses who've been active in politics before, but I don't think we've ever seen anything like this, where the spouse of a sitting justice was urging the overturning of a Democratic election.
And so the lawyer that you spoke with, who worked with Ken Starr, did he go beyond and say people like Rudy Giuliani are also criminally culpable, or anyone else that we talked about?
Yeah, we didn't get into that, but I think that there's certainly other lawyers out there who would tell you that yes, that a number of these people around President Trump have potential exposure, and I think there's a reason why they asked for pardons, because they knew that. One of the things that Cassidy Hutchinson told us yesterday that had not been made public was among the people who asked for pardons in the last few days of the administration was her own boss, Mark Meadows, that the president's own chief of staff thought he needed a pardon to protect himself from criminal prosecution after leaving office, which is an extraordinary revelation we didn't know before. We don't know why that didn't happen, why the pardon wasn't granted. Mark Meadows has not commented on it one way or the other. She also told us that Rudy Giuliani sought a pardon in those last days, and that 6 members of Congress, Republican members of Congress who were involved in trying to overturn the election, had asked for pardons. Some of them have disputed that. But that's, I think, telling in a lot of ways.
And we don't know why he did not grant these pardons.
We don't know. It may be that they decided that it would be tantamount to admitting guilt. After Ford pardoned Nixon, he walked around for the rest of his life with a copy of a Supreme Court decision in his wallet from the early 1900s that said that somebody who has been granted a presidential pardon has in effect accepted that they were guilty. And Ford walked around for the rest of his life saying, see, I didn't let Nixon off the hook by pardoning him in effect, and he accepting the pardon, he acknowledged his culpability, acknowledges his guilt. A lot of people didn't believe that or accept that because they didn't think Nixon accepted that. But it may be that Trump and his people thought that having pardons would indicate that they knew they were doing something wrong when he believed, or at least said he didn't think he was.
Okay, well, let's leave this for a little bit. I'm sure we'll get back to it when I get to the viewer questions. But I want to move into the current administration because you are Chief White House correspondent, and let's talk about, I mean, just what is politically Biden's and Biden's inner circle saying about what's happening with his popularity, his effects on the midterms, and whether or not he's going to run again.
Yeah, it's a great question. These are tough days at the Biden White House. They're not doing very well. They know that. They're very frustrated, I think, because basically they can't seem to, from their point of view, catch a break. Their critics would say that's because they, made some bad choices in their own policies. But right now, they've got the war in Russia, the war in Ukraine with Russia. They've got high inflation. They've got, a sort of a sour public that's not very happy, that doesn't think that Biden has either accomplished what he said he would or doesn't want him to accomplish the things that he wants to accomplish. So his popularity numbers are down in the low 40s, getting close to Trump territory. So they're looking at a tough midterm election. Now, they do think that the overturning of Roe v. Wade may change that somewhat. It may galvanize younger voters. It may galvanize complacent Democrats who didn't take seriously the threat to abortion rights in the past. Polls do show that more Americans support abortion rights than wanted Roe v. Wade to be overturned. But the question is whether they can actually translate that into votes in the fall and change the current political dynamics. Right now, most people in Washington would tell you it's almost a done deal that the Republicans will win the House. The Senate's a little bit more uncertain, even though it's 50-50, only one seat needs to change hands. The Democrats have incumbents who are in somewhat better shape, and the Republicans are gambling on some pretty far to the right candidates in some of the states where they otherwise might have a pretty good chance of pickup. So it's going to be a real question. Can Raphael Warnock in Georgia, for instance, hold on against Herschel Walker, who's got all these scandals going on? Can Dr. Oz in Pennsylvania hang on to that Republican seat, or will John Fetterman, whose health is a question right now, be able to return to the campaign trail? So there's some real uncertainties there. Broadly speaking, I think that the White House understands, or believes anyway, that they are not going to be able to convince people that Joe Biden is doing a good job. And therefore, the argument they're going to make in the fall is, you may not like what we're doing, but those other guys are much worse. And it's going to be a very ugly and negative campaign in which both Democrats and Republicans are trying to say the other guys are horrible. And if you don't elect us, nobody's going to stop them from doing the terrible things that they're doing. So he's going to get out there and talk about the ultra MAGA crowd and talk about, the crazy Marjorie Taylor Greene crowd, in his view, as he'll put it, Lauren Boebert and all those kind of people. And then you're going to have the Trump folks and his allies on the Republican side talk about socialism and AOC and all of that. And I think that historically, the in party, which is quite right now, the Democrats, doesn't do well in midterm elections. And the state of the economy itself is not that bad, but inflation being so bad has soured people.
Yeah. Well, are there some candidates who are not wanting to have him come and campaign for them, and just because they don't want to be tied to him?
Yeah, of course. I mean, president's at 40%. Is that a guy you want to come? He's not going to be an asset for you. And they know that. In the White House, they'll tell you that they're not going to be able to help people. And probably the most important indicator historically for how a party does in the midterm is the approval rating of its sitting incumbent president. And I can't think of an example where you have a president at 40-some% whose party did okay in the midterm. Just hasn't happened. Now, doesn't mean it can't happen. This is weird times. And again, the Roe v. Wade thing may be a wild card that changes, the complexion. But history does not look good right now for the Democrats.
Well, and speaking of that, the Roe v. Wade part of that. There's also the problem of the restive left in the party who don't think that Biden et al. In the establishment have done enough, and they're pretty angry.
Yeah, they are. And I think that, if you look at his poll numbers, so why is he 10 points below or so where he won the election in 2020? A lot of those are people who are independents or Democrats. They're not Republicans who have left him. They weren't with him to begin with. And in some cases, those are Democrats who are disappointed with him, who thought he would be more of a change agent than he turned out to be, that the promises of Build Back Better and other big legislation that didn't come forward have disappointed them. There are a lot of people on the left who are mad that he won't be more aggressive on abortion, that he won't pack the court by adding seats, that he won't bust the filibuster to pass voting rights legislation and gun legislation that's more substantial than what he's just signed. So you're right. There's a lot of restiveness within the Democratic Party. I mean, and that's the challenge for them is saying, okay, you may not be happy with everything that I've been doing, but the alternative is going to be worse. And the question is that enough to get Democrats who are unhappy to come out to the polls?
But they have to be thinking about 2024 as well, right? I mean, they have to be looking at these numbers and wondering what is going to happen, especially, if Trump is still as popular as he is now amongst his base and runs again, or if Ron DeSantis runs, who is already raising lots and lots of money. So what is the thinking inside the White House when it comes to Biden, his popularity, and how he could possibly turn it around in advance of his reelection campaign, if he does in fact have a reelection campaign?
Right. Well, that if is an important point, but we'll come back to that. There are 2 points. The first point is history. Okay, so if history tells us that the incumbent party is going to lose in a midterm, it also tells us that that's not necessarily a death blow for an incumbent president. So Bill Clinton lost Congress in 1994. 2 years later, won a resounding reelection. Barack Obama lost the House in 2010. 2 years later, came back and won a pretty convincing reelection. Donald Trump lost the House in 2018 and came pretty close to, at least not in the popular vote, but in terms of the electoral college vote, to winning a second term. So it's not a death blow necessarily to lose in the midterm, because there's time between 2 years from now to 2024 is an eternity in politics. There's also the feeling in the White House that it may be enough time for the economy to get back in shape in a way that provides a lift for President Biden. That inflation by then will be tamed because the Fed is going to bring up these rates. If we have a recession, it will be over by then. Hopefully it will be mild in their view, and that the country will be on the upswing. Ronald Reagan had a bad midterm in 1982. Unemployment was gotten up 10%. By 1984, the economy was doing well. So it had gone through the tough part in time for him to win re-election. That's what they're thinking in Biden. Now, there's a second question, which you alluded to. Is there a re-election campaign? Let's not forget that Joe Biden is 79 years old. He's older than Reagan was. He's older than Reagan was today than Reagan was on the day Reagan left office. Wow. So he's not only the oldest president ever, he's older after 1.5 years than Reagan was after 8 years in office. And what he's asking, in theory, if he's going to run for re-election, which he says he's going to, he's asking the public to entrust him with the White House until he is 86 years old. Okay. Now, that may be what the country wants. It may trust Joe Biden to be a better candidate than any of the other Democrats or Donald Trump. The White House view is that Biden is the only guy who ever beat Trump, and therefore he's the only guy you can assume will beat him again in 2 years, and therefore stick with him. I think it's still an open question whether he really runs, even though they swear up and down that he will, in part because it gets them nothing to say now that he won't, right? The minute he says he's not running, he becomes a lame duck.
Yeah.
Right. So it's in their interest to keep the idea that he's going to run again for as long as possible. So there's that. And it may be that he genuinely thinks he's going to run again. Politicians and presidents think that they can always run again. And it may be that something happens between now and then that changes that calculation. And maybe Jill Biden says to Joe Biden, okay, it's enough. It's time to retire and have some time with your grandkids. the challenge for the Democrats is there's nobody waiting in the ring, waiting in the wings, who appears to be dominant or compelling in a way that you can say, aha, okay, if Biden doesn't run, it'll be X and that person will win the nomination. It doesn't appear to be that Vice President Kamala Harris has secured the support of the party. She may run and she may win if there's no Biden second term, but if she's got to work hard for it, because she's in a hole right now. Who else is out there? Pete Buttigieg, maybe Gavin Newsom, maybe, governors like Phil Murphy from New Jersey, Roy Cooper from North Carolina. I think you might see Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders run again if the president doesn't run. So it's a wide open field if he doesn't run. And I think that the argument the White House is making is none of those people has a proven track record of beating Donald Trump. That's the most important thing. Everything else is secondary.
And when did they have to make this announcement? Yay or nay?
Traditionally, you would say after the midterm, basically between November of this year and January of next year. If they haven't at least signaled strongly what's happening, then they'll be putting their own party in jeopardy. Because if the longer he holds on, if he's not going to end up running, the more he freezes the field and makes it harder for whoever might come next to build support, to build a fundraising base, to build public awareness and all of that. So I think that the traditional thinking in Washington anyway is that between November and January, he's going to have to pretty much let us know for sure what he's doing.
Okay, let's get to Ukraine, which was the title of this talk. Finally get to Ukraine. All right, so big news from NATO, expanding to include Finland and Sweden, and also announcing that they will put US forces for the first time permanently in Poland, right? What will that do for the trajectory of this war? What does that signal to Vladimir Putin? Does it change his thinking in any way?
I don't know that it changes his thinking. It certainly belies the thinking of his invasion in the first place. Vladimir Putin wanted to weaken NATO. He wanted to undercut NATO. And instead, what he's done is expand it. He said that one of the reasons why Russia is unhappy is because NATO has expanded these last 20 years or so from the end of the Cold War. And in fact, now is expanding because of him. Finland and Sweden stayed neutral for 40 years during the Cold War. Stalin didn't make Finland and Sweden want to join NATO. Khrushchev didn't make Sweden and Finland want to join NATO. Neither did Brezhnev, but Vladimir Putin has. So everything he set out as his goals for this war have turned out to be the opposite. He did not take Kiev. He did not install a puppet regime. He did not take over the whole country. Now, it is true that they have pretty solid control of a slice of the eastern part of Ukraine, and it may be hard for Ukraine to dislodge them. I mean, if you ask me what the outcome is going to be, I don't know, but it would not surprise me to see sort of what we call a frozen conflict there sort of settle in for the next few years, where basically the Russians hold tight to the territory that they've taken. They may even try to annex it or declare it to be part of their territory. The Ukrainians don't accept it. They continue to fight, but on a less, all out kind of way. And it becomes sort of a de facto carving up of the country to some extent. At some point, the weaponry that the West is giving Ukraine, the United States and Europe, that pipeline is going to run dry at some point. Just there's going to be fatigue in the West. It's a lot of money. We spent tens of billions of dollars. Ultimately, Congress is only going to go along with that for so long. Ultimately, there's only so many weapons that we have to ship them. We've shipped them now. Every Soviet-made weapon that ever used to be in NATO storehouses and warehouses, it's been given to the Ukrainians. There's none left. And we're not making any more Soviet-made weapons, which is how they know how to, weapons that they know how to use. So we're now starting to give them NATO armaments. But it's going to be a limit to that. So, you could see a sort of an unsatisfying end to this, or not end, but an unsatisfying continuation of this war that could go on for years. And that's, of course, it's not a victory for Vladimir Putin, but it's also not a victory for the West either.
But if they're being given weapons that they aren't trained to use, does that not mean that the West will be involved more, at least to train troops?
Yeah, I think that it's interesting. The story has kind of fallen off the front pages on a lot of days. It isn't quite as dominant as it once was because there are other things going on and people gotten a little tired of it. But in the White House, they're worried that there's actually more risk today of escalation than there was in the past. that the dangers of an unintended spreading of this war have grown, not shrunk. That an errant Russian missile that flies into Poland or Romania by mistake, not intended, but then forces NATO to respond, and then who knows what comes from there. There's a phrase they use in the Situation Room. They call it escalate to de-escalate. It's kind of sounds like a very Orwellian phrase, but by that they mean, if the Russians were to do something, we would have to do something in response in order to keep it from getting even worse. That's a hell of a thing to depend on, right? So there's a real fear right now in the White House that while the country is not paying as much attention to Ukraine as it was, while there's more public fatigue over the war, that it's actually in a pretty dangerous state right now.
There's been a lot of speculation over Putin's health. Do you know anything about it?
I don't really. Putin is about 69, if I remember correctly. He obviously took a rather extreme response to COVID, in which he not only isolated himself the way others might have isolated himself, he isolated himself even from his own people, from his own coterie of aides and advisors. You saw these pictures of him having these conversations at this long conference table with the other people way away from him. That's weird, right? And that has sparked a lot of speculation about what does that mean? Is he mentally healthy? Is he gone off the deep end somehow? What I've heard some people who are in touch with the intelligence agencies say is their speculation is that it's possible he has some sort of a thyroid condition and that he has used steroids, which might explain the puffy face and also might explain some of the erratic or at least counterproductive, moves that he's made. People told him before the war that this might not go well. It was not necessarily a good idea, and he did it anyway. And you can argue that you could speculate that maybe that has something to do with health or some sort of medication that he's on. Nobody that I know of knows for sure.
Okay, let's get to a couple of questions from the viewers. Craig asks, what is your assessment of the state of the Russian military?
Well, I mean, they've been shown obviously to be much more of a paper tiger than we had thought, right? And that's one more example of how Putin has misplayed his hand. Instead of being feared, now people are going to look at Russia and say, well, they're not the big giants that they thought they were, right? And he spent 20 years, my wife and I were there at the beginning of Putin's tenure. We were there for 4 years. They spent these last 22 years or so rebuilding the Russian military to be a fearsome force again. And it was basically in Syria. And it more or less was in taking Crimea and the eastern parts of Ukraine to begin with in 2014. But today it's been shown to be, a dysfunctional organization, that they have a bad command structure, that they were not prepared for this, that they were not honest with their own troops, many of whom did not want to be fighting their Slavic brothers. That their weaponry is not as precise as they had advertised, and that I think we're learning a lot about this military. The Pentagon's assessment had been, before the war began, that they could take Kyiv, the capital, within a week. That didn't happen. So we've now learned a lot about the Russian military.
Why didn't the Pentagon have an accurate assessment of their abilities before this?
Well, look, I think you're always to the temptation to overestimate your opponent is large, because the risks of underestimating them is larger, right? You never want to underestimate your opponent. So you often ascribe greater, assessments of them than you really ought to. And that's a big question that should come under scrutiny at some point. What led us to that assessment?
Yeah,
we did it during the Cold War. I mean, remember, Kennedy won in 1960, in part by talking about a missile gap, saying that the Russians were far ahead of us in missiles, when in fact it was the opposite. It was the opposite. So, the intelligence agencies knew that at the time, but they didn't tell the public. So, there should be a reckoning at some point to look back, not to hold people accountable and say somebody did something wrong, but just to figure out how is it we came up with this assessment, why do we make it, how did it turn out to be wrong?
Right, because it does call into question our entire intelligence apparatus if we can't get the basic idea right.
Now, but what they did get right, and we shouldn't forget, is they knew what he was going to do. Right. And they told us this again and again and again, that he was going to try to invade. He was going to try to come up with some false flag excuse for an invasion. They told the world. A lot of people didn't believe them, including the Ukrainians. And they were correct in assessing Vladimir Putin's intentions, which is a hard thing to do.
Okay, Philip asks, will Zelensky give up some of Ukraine to make a deal with Russia? And I guess I'll add on to that. What could possibly get him to do that at this point?
Yeah, that's my question too, Philip. I think it's a great question because that's really the choice he's now facing. See, if the Russians basically have consolidated themselves in the East, and there it's going to be hard to dislodge them militarily. Is there a solution? Is there a agreement that he can agree to? He said, I think that he thinks the war will be over by the end of the year, but that's only going to be the case if he negotiates something, because there doesn't seem to be a military solution by the end of the year that ejects Russian troops from all territory of Ukraine. Now, it becomes a de facto thing, even if he doesn't, quote, accept it, unquote, that it becomes something he has to live with, even if he doesn't, ever openly say this is okay. Remember, for 40 years, we didn't accept that Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were part of the Soviet Union, even though they were. I mean, officially, we did not recognize that diplomatically. You could have a situation where for years, the Ukrainian government says, we don't recognize the Russian presence in the East, but has to live with it because they can only do so much. So we don't know. We'll see. I think that the public in Ukraine is so radicalized by the Russian invasion that it's not going to be a popular thing to say we're going to negotiate away part of our territory. And that's a real challenge for Zelensky. I don't think he wants to do anything that would be seen as doing that.
Yeah. All right. We have some other questions about, here's one more about Ukraine. Brett asks, when the war in Ukraine ends, will Russia return to being part of the world community?
I mean, not very fast, and not under this leadership. I don't think that there's, I think it's gone too far at this point. It's I have to say sad. It's sad for Russia. As somebody who spent 4 years there and knows and likes a lot of the Russian people we made friends with and got to know. This is a terrible thing for Russia too. I mean, they're not dying the way the Ukrainians are in the same proportions. And so obviously Ukraine is suffering more than anybody, but it's also bad for Russia, for a lot of people in Russia who thought they had begun to be part of the world, right? They had begun to integrate again with the outside world. They could have Western goods. They could travel abroad. They could, log on to the internet and learn things. They could be part of the community of nations. And the West has successfully, in a lot of ways, cut that off in a very rapid time. 20 some years, 30 some years of progress has been wiped out basically in the space of a few months. And my friends who live there, many of them have left the country because they can't live there anymore. And where are they going to go? And it's no longer a country they recognize, no longer a country they think that they can help shape its future. Many Russians are perfectly happy with the Russia-Ukraine war, fine. But for many Russians who think this is an abomination, this has left them without a country. And it's a terrible tragedy for Russia, even if many Russians, not all Russians, see it that way. So I find, it's not going to return to normal anytime fast unless there's some sort of a change in government that takes a radically different point of view.
What, if you could give us an insight, what is your friend, what are their lives like?
Well, I had one friend, a very, very good friend of ours, who literally went to the airport with a backpack, and that's all she had. And she and her husband own an apartment in Moscow that they don't think they're ever going to go back to. Wow. She came here to Washington for a little while, then she moved back to Europe, and they're looking to set up a place in Poland, perhaps, or it's for a lot of our Russian friends, they moved to Georgia, the old Soviet Republic of Georgia. They've moved to Warsaw or London, Prague, and they don't know that they're ever going to go home. And imagine leaving everybody behind. Imagine leaving everything you had behind, and not all because they're dissidents, but just because they can't bear to live in a country that is closing up, that is shutting down its own free speech, its own, to the extent that there ever was any, that is shutting down dissent, and that is doing such violence to people who are considered to be their Slavic brothers and sisters. I mean, this is not like a war against Afghanistan or Chechnya, where the other side may seem foreign to them. The Ukrainians are people that Russians see as being fraternal, relatives, and that has made this a very, very hard moment for many Russians.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe one or two more questions. This one kind of gets at both topics of conversation. Peter in Santa Monica, how good was Russian intelligence on Trump? Did they know how volatile and unstable he is?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish we knew the answer to that. I think that one of the things we heard during our book is that for all of Trump's admiration or whatever you want to call it for Putin, it was not shared. Like in these private meetings, Putin did not, he kind of looked down his nose at Trump. That he thought Trump was kind of a, buffoon or something. I don't know what he thought exactly, but he did not act all admiring of Trump. It was a one-way street. I think that they saw Trump as somebody who was that would be more conducive to their point of view on some things, but also because he was volatile, in some ways made it harder for them to have a relationship with the United States. Because in fact, Trump was suspected of being too close to Russia, the collusion issue, all of that kind of thing. He couldn't cut deals with Russia that a Barack Obama could have done, or even a Joe Biden. But of course, they chose not to cut a deal with Joe Biden either. So it may be that we're beyond, the ability to influence Russian thinking, and that any president, Democrat or Republican, is caught out right now with Putin. That he's head in a different direction.
Speaking of cutting deals, I know you interviewed Jared Kushner for your book. Can you talk about this deal that he cut with the Saudis?
Yeah, well, he's got a deal with a fund that's controlled by MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, who's the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia, that provided $2 billion for a private equity fund that Jared Kushner is running. There was a real debate among the people who control that Saudi fund as to whether or not that was a really good idea, whether it was a good investment or not. MBS, who had formed a close bond with Kushner, decided that it was worth it. And I think that, we're in this position right now where, because people expect Trump to run again around the world, it raises questions about the motivations for any business deals that they might do with him or his family at this point. Is the business deal with Jared Kushner all about business because they think that Jared Kushner would do a good job of investing that money, or does it have something to do with the future possibility that there might be a second Trump term? We don't know, and that's always going to be a question that people ask, which is why it's so problematic to be doing that in the first place.
How forthright was he, or how forthcoming, I should say, was he and Ivanka in speaking with you? How?
Oh, well, we haven't said who we've interviewed. Most of our interviews are all on background and so forth. So we're not getting into who we interviewed and who didn't interview with us. The only person we can tell you for sure who interviews with us was Donald Trump. We did have 2 interviews with him at Mar-a-Lago, which were quite something.
Can you describe that at all?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because he wants to talk to reporters, even as he calls us the enemy of the people, and even as he knows, we're not going to write the kind of book that he thinks is fair, because we're just never going to be, writing, a pro or con book. It's a journalistic effort. It's meant to be, factual, not a polemic that he would like it to be. And yet he can't help himself and still ends up wanting to talk to journalists, even as he thinks that they're going to shaft him. So he puts on a show. The first interview he did with us was in his lobby of Mar-a-Lago as the customers were coming in for the evening, and people would wave at him. He's waving at him. Hey, I've got the New York Times and the New Yorker here. It's all part of the show. And then after he's done with us, he goes out into the back patio and he makes an appearance with the crowd, and they all stand and cheer. And there's a charitable fundraiser going on. And then he goes to his table, which is roped off with a red velvet rope, where he sits and has dinner with a couple of aides. And it's all part of the show. And it's funny. He's a character, to say the least. But it's, for him, a lot of this is entertainment. He's still the reality show host, and he enjoys the showmanship angle of this. And if it weren't so serious as we've seen in these hearings in the last few weeks, you might look at it differently, but it is serious. And that's why the showman, I think a lot of accounts and a lot of books have emphasized the sort of the circus aspect of the Trump White House. I think that misses the larger point. That's important. That's, we cover that in our book as well. But the larger point is the war on institutions that he waged that culminated on January 6th. And the conceit of our book is you can't understand January 6, 2021, unless you understand January 20th, 2017, when he takes office, and every day in between. And it was not an aberration on January 6th. This was 4 years in the making. And that's what our book tries to do.
All right, that comes out end of September.
September 20th. Yeah.
All right.
You can pre-order it now.
The Divider.
Divider.
All right. Well, Peter, it's been a pleasure having you back. Thank you.
No, thank you so much. What a great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Me too. And stay tuned for our conversation next week. David Brooks will be speaking with Larry Mantle. David Brooks, also from the New York Times. So definitely tune in for that. Same time, same channel. And I will see you soon too. Thank you. Have a great night.